When Pokemon Sword and Shield came out on the Nintendo Switch, a lot of people said they were going to boycott those and any other games going forward. At least until Game Freak could bring the National Dex back, stop phoning the graphics in, and quit rushing new games out just for the sake of pumping them out and milking the IP. Despite the boycott threats though, Pokemon Sword and Shield would go on to become the fastest selling Pokemon games in the franchise and the second best selling Pokemon games total. So needless to say, Game Freak didn't learn a friggin' thing, which is why literally nothing's changed in the mainline games to date. However, just because Game Freak hasn't changed their tune just yet, I still don't think it was a waste of time and effort to have committed to a boycott. And if you give me a wee bit, I'll tell you why myself, along with the 3 or 4 other people who actually kept their word, shouldn't regret a thing. I'm sure there's probably some diehard Pokemon fans already farting in the comments right now, but like, if you just want to play some new Pokemon games and don't mind a few glitches or lack of a National Dex and state-of-the-art graphics, then that's fine. More power to you. In fact, I'm sure Sword, Shield, Scarlet, and Violet are still fun games in their own right, all things considered, but what can I say? For the biggest media franchise in the world, I personally find the graphics and glitches to be phoned in and or rushed. Like, I care about graphics way less than the average person does, so if it were just that, then I'd just laugh at the memes, move on, and enjoy the games anyway. But like, if Game Freak's not even gonna redo the graphical style and make new 3D models for all the Pokemon anyway in favor of keeping the 3DS look, then I'm sorry, there's just no excuse for excluding the National Dex. Around the time Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee came out, I actually predicted that Pokemon would get rid of the National Dex for the 8th generation, and I used to be okay with it, to be honest. But the only reason I was okay with it is because I mistakenly assumed that Game Freak would do an overhaul in the graphics and create badass new 3D models for every Pokemon in existence like they deserve. Like, obviously it'd be way too much to have to catch 1,000 Pokemon in one pair of games, but I should at least be allowed to transfer my older parties that I've been holding onto for decades into the newest post-games. After all, that's how things used to be when everybody was happy. Like, at its core, this is obviously not a really big deal, but it's more the principle of taking a stand against a company trying to get away with giving us less and convincing us that it's natural. For example, video game publishers would prefer if physical media disappear altogether because they wouldn't have to worry about the consumer reselling their games. But the thing is, they couldn't just ditch physical games out of nowhere without a disaster on their hands like we saw with the PSP Go, and similarly with Xbox One's original DRM policies that, to be fair, Sony intended to implement themselves before they saw how catastrophic it was for Microsoft to announce it. Fast forward a few years later, though, the tables had turned because many companies tricked people into believing that physical media should just disappear altogether. This didn't happen overnight, but over time, physical games started sucking more and more little by little with things like massive Day 1 patches and on-disc DLC, but now I'm getting a little bit off topic. The point is that if you put a frog in boiling water, it'll jump out, but if you put a frog in normal water and turn the temperature up a little bit over time, it'll hang around until it boils and dies. Again, Sword and Shield having a few glitches, underwhelming visuals, and only featuring 400 out of 1,000 Pokemon isn't that big of a deal on its own, but it was still the beginning of the water temperature rising, in my opinion. So that's why I went ahead and jumped out, because I knew that if people still bought these games in droves, then all it would do is tell Game Freak that there's absolutely no need to change and that everything they're doing is perfect. Ideally, big corporations still listen to fans who have complaints, but don't forget that the main thing these companies are always going to listen to the most are sales figures. Because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how much you complain about something. When you buy a product, you're telling the publisher that you literally find it irresistible and that nothing they're doing is a big deal to you. Some people think they're slick by getting used copies, but in the grand scheme of things, this still keeps the aftermarket prices up, and if the aftermarket prices are high, most people are just gonna buy new anyway, so you're still supporting Game Freak if you buy Pokemon used. Not only that, but you're also telling them that you find their games irresistible. And sure enough, Scarlet and Violet came out, nothing changed. Again, I'm sure the games are still fun, but of course the graphics still suck even for the Switch, and the National Dex is nowhere to be seen in the post-game. Tens of millions of people literally just told them that it's not a big deal when they bought Sword and Shield in record numbers. And you know what? Maybe it's really not a big deal, so you probably think I feel pretty stupid now to see my boycott attempt go up in flames. But to be honest, I really don't, because even though Pokemon's still a juggernaut with Scarlet and Violet becoming the fastest selling Nintendo games ever, period, I'd argue that the Switch Pokemon games would have been even bigger if they had gotten the effort they deserved. It's impossible to prove whether or not this is true, of course, but I think the best evidence we have can be attributed to the success of Palworld. Full disclosure, I haven't even played Palworld yet at the time of this recording, so for all I know, it's gonna end up being a flash in the pan that everyone forgets about. And even if that ends up being the case, it's still impossible to ignore the success of 7 million sales within 5 days. Granted, the game's only $25, but it's also on Game Pass, which a lot of people are already paying for anyway. And it's not even the finished version of the game, which proves that monster collecting fans still want more. And if Sword, Shield, Scarlet, and Violet have blown everybody away, then I don't think Palworld would have been this successful. I mean, I'm sure it'd have still been a big deal given that it's offering things that Pokemon never can, like guns and well, slavery apparently, but I don't think it'd have been such a phenomenon without so many lapsed Pokemon fans wanting more. Based on pure conjecture and no real studies at all, I'd bet like $13 that many of these millions of people who bought Palworld either skipped Sword, Shield, Scarlet, and Violet, or were at the very least underwhelmed by them and left wanting more. You see, Pokemon's a lot like the WWE, and if you don't like wrestling, then just bear with me here for a minute. For decades, WWE is what most people think about when you mention pro wrestling, just like how people think about Pokemon when you mention monster collecting video games. Then, after decades of being the biggest company by a long shot, WWE got worse and worse to the point where nothing made sense anymore to a lot of people. Well, you know, less sense than normal anyway. A lot of fans didn't notice they were in boiling water because the temperature was increasing slowly over time, but many fans were still driven off little by little over time. And yet, despite driving fans off in droves, the company was still the biggest in the world of wrestling, causing many people to argue against the idea that WWE was doing anything wrong at all. This continued on and on for years until eventually there were enough lapsed wrestling fans to provide demand for an alternative that at least attempted to give them what they wanted, and thus AEW was born. It wasn't perfect by any means, and in fact, it was actually pretty unpolished in a lot of ways, but lapsed fans were still willing to overlook a lot just because of how frustrated they'd become with the old guard. Despite starting from scratch out of nowhere with no history, they were able to give WWE its first real competition in 20 years, even outdrawing them in certain markets numerous times, drawing higher demos on their main shows every now and then, and even running a show that sold more tickets than any WWE show ever. Sure, AEW was never able to come close to putting WWE out of business or anything like that, but it did manage to thrive, and the main reason for its existence in the first place is because of how poor WWE's quality had become, despite the fact that the company was still the biggest juggernaut in the industry, even at its worst. So just because Pokemon's the biggest media franchise in the world does not mean that it isn't doing anything wrong, and that it wouldn't be even bigger if it would just fix some issues that lapsed fans like me have. Issues that it's completely capable of fixing, by the way, if they just hire a few more people or take a little bit more time. Besides, with there being way too many games in my backlog from the past and present, it's not like I need a watered-down Pokemon experience to occupy my time, so it's not even that my conviction's that strong, it's just that it's really easy to skip so-so games that I only kinda want to play. Also, full disclosure, I did give Pokemon Legends a try, because even though it didn't have the National Dex, it was still at least just a spin-off that was trying something new. And after all, I never cared that Pokemon Conquest didn't have the full National Dex. If Pokemon's not going to give me the best mainline games possible, though, it's very easy to choose other games instead, despite the fact that I'm sure watered-down Pokemon's still great, just like mediocre pizza. Except for Tony's store-bought pizza, though, frig that. Literally the only pizza I've ever disliked in my life, and I tried it twice, too, so don't at me. The fact that Pokemon rushed so many divisive mainline games out on the Switch is what drove so many people to Palworld in the first place. So while mine and a few other people's boycotts certainly didn't teach a direct lesson to Pokemon all by itself, it certainly played a small part in what cracked the door open to Pokemon's first real competition probably ever, even if it does end up just being a flash in the pan, which my butt tells me it won't be. Of course, hardcore Pokemon fans and Pokemon Company alike could probably deny that Palworld's real competition, just like WWE denied that AEW was competition, purely because one company's clearly bigger than the other. But even though Palworld will absolutely not put Pokemon out of business or anything close to that, it still did the unthinkable by stealing a piece of the pie that the Pokemon Company has to feel entitled is all theirs. And you know what? Maybe that slice wouldn't have been so big if Pokemon Company had just not driven so many fans off in the first place. You know what? Maybe Palworld will be the kick in the pee-pee Pokemon's been needing the past few years, and that they'll finally be fun again as a result of the competition like WWE. As far as my boycott's concerned, though, I don't think my requirements to get me back are all that unreasonable. I'm fine with the same formulaic Pokemon adventure over and over, but they can't give me less than the bare minimum, and to me, the bare minimum's having the full National Dex in the post-game. They don't have to let me catch every Pokemon ever in every game, just let me transfer all my old ones into the newer games is all. And if they're hell-bent on keeping the Pokemon count to a minimum, then alright, fine. But you gotta give me a fresh new experience that blows my mind with amazing graphics and new 3D models. And until then, I'm gonna give Palworld a chance to fulfill my needs that just aren't being met with Pokemon. I mean, after all, it's on Game Pass, so it's not like I have anything to lose. Anyway, that's all for today, but if you got a kick out of my incoherent, rambling, and disturbing imagery, though, then you should check out my video on the Snowboard Kids series. But if you'll excuse me, though, I gotta go water my uncle. Later!